Why did you want to have contact with me?
We'd got a lot of questions about the night, and the only person that could answer them was yourself.
Restorative justice is communication. It's about helping people that have been affected by crime have that opportunity to talk about what happened and hopefully find some way forward.
My name is Jacob Dunn. I'm an author, campaigner, and educator in restorative justice. In 2011, I threw a single punch that ended another man's life. And after 14 months in prison, I found myself homeless, unemployed, and struggling to find a sense of purpose. But I managed to get my life back on track. And now I help others do the same. Join me on this first season of Right from Wrong, where I speak to the people who were instrumental in my journey from punishment to redemption. This is Right from Wrong. It's a pleasure to have you back with me for this episode of Right from Wrong. This is a big episode, the heart of the series, and you could say where I connected back with my own heart. In the last episode, we spoke with Wendy, my probation officer, about where I was in my life after being convicted of manslaughter. A combination of being scared, shameful, but not knowing how to deal with it, and of course, feeling sorry for myself. The truth is, I was terrible at putting myself in other people's shoes, expressing myself healthily, or taking responsibility. I didn't trust many people, and I used my criminal record, being homeless, having learning difficulties, and not having any qualifications as an excuse not to try. It is much easier to stay as we are and make excuses, and my excuses were pretty good reasons not to have faith in trying another way. However good they were, though, they were still just excuses. As you heard in episode 1 with Akai, I developed ways of thinking with my friends and environment that were only ever going to harm myself and others, and I could not see a way out. I had to be honest and accountable about the choices I had made and the impact I had had on myself and others. But to really do that type of processing, I needed to feel safe enough to process those feelings and be vulnerable. Ignorance is bliss, and it's much easier to hide from the truth than try and face it. The previous episode with Wendy partly highlighted how prison makes it easier for people to hide from the truth as well. Thankfully, I was given the opportunity to lean into those feelings and face them when Nicola, my next guest, rocked up at the probation office to tell me what restorative justice was, to tell me about why the people I had harmed the most wanted to ask me some questions. The questions Nicola wanted to ask me were on behalf of my other guest today, Joan Schofield, the mother of my victim, James Hodgkinson, who I so tragically punched on that fatal night in 2011. When we recorded this episode, we were sat in an office together, about to go and meet Michael Palin and watch a show about our lives at the Nottingham Playhouse by James Graham, raising awareness of the dangers of throwing a single punch and to promote better ways of resolving conflict. It's fair to say we'd all come a long way. So please welcome Joan and Nicola to the show. Joan, you are an incredible woman. Words will never do justice to the impact you have had on my life. You held me to account. You challenged me. You had the courage to ask me questions only I had the answers to. You prevented me from making any more excuses and from hiding behind not knowing the impact that my actions had on you and your family. You told me about the type of person your son was, and as a result, made me want to do no more harm to myself or others, which meant me having to learn to love myself again, because it is hurt people that hurt people. Nicola, it's fair to say we have all come a long way, right?
Absolutely.
Joan and I would never have been sat here if it had not been for you carefully facilitating those difficult but important conversations back when this journey began. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you both for helping me help myself and become the person I am today, albeit we're all still a work in progress. And I wonder if either of you had any reflections to that very long monologue of mine.
I think it describes the journey, doesn't it? That, like you say, it's been many years since we started on this journey. And for me, to have been part of this journey and to see the progress that you've all made has been amazing.
Yeah, so I feel that at the beginning it was just questions that we got answered about the night, and rightly so, only you could answer those, which you did. But little did we know that this would grow and we would contribute together and make something positive and get the best set of restorative justice as we have.
Yeah.
And before we go further into the episode, I just wanted to let the audience know that I am equally appreciative of David, James's father, who I also went through the restorative justice process with, but he's not joining us today for this episode. So where do we begin? I guess before we talk about, how we ended up getting here, it's that question of kind of what is restorative justice?
I suppose, the most simple way of explaining restorative justice is it's about communication. It's about helping people that have been affected by crime have that opportunity to talk about what happened and hopefully find some way forward from that. It can take many different forms, and quite often some people don't feel comfortable with a face-to-face meeting. Initially, that can seem quite daunting, quite scary. More often than not, people will start with indirect messages through practitioners because it gives them an opportunity to see how the process works, to see how that other person is responding. And then if they feel confident enough, they will move on to a face-to-face. But again, some people won't. An indirect message might be enough for somebody.
Yeah.
I suppose from somebody that's been harmed by a crime, restorative justice gives them a chance to ask questions, a chance to really explain the impact of what's happened to the person responsible and get answers to those questions that only really that one person can answer. There's only really one person that can help that person to stop asking those questions, running around their head at night, stopping them from sleeping. And from the person that's committed that crime, I suppose it gives them an opportunity to explain what was going on for them at that point in their life, what led up to it, and maybe offer some way of trying to apologise or make amends if that's what's right for everybody involved. It's completely voluntary. It's not something that, can be forced upon anybody. It has to be about everybody being willing to be part of that to get the best from it.
Is there any other requirements for taking part?
There has to be that acceptance of responsibility from the person that's committed the crime, that minimum accountability, that recognition that harm was caused. If somebody was in denial, then obviously we wouldn't be able to proceed with that. And it's about, I suppose, acknowledging that we're trying to address the harm that's been caused and move forward, as opposed to trying to obtain revenge in any way or for it to be completely punitive. It's about having that communication with a way to trying to help people cope and recover from what's happened.
In this episode, we'll be able to give a little bit more detail as to kind of that journey and how we did get to this position. So, Nicola, you're the best person to kind of start with on that, I guess, because I was in the blue. I was in the dark. I was oblivious. I didn't know who David and Joan were. I was in prison. I was, as I described in my monologue, was feeling a bit sorry for myself. And came out of prison, was with my probation officer trying to get myself back on my feet. Had no idea what was going on in that time that you were speaking to David and Joan, or that David and Joan were considering restorative justice. Can we, start there?
Yes. Remedy had been commissioned by the National Victim Support Homicide Service to deliver restorative justice in cases where someone had been bereaved through murder or manslaughter. So it was a new partnership relationship that we had in the December of 2012. And I recall the very first referral that we received was the one from David and Joan. And I was overseeing that piece of work at the time in terms of that relationship. And I worked with one of our volunteers, Jan. Jan and I, first of all, had contact with Rick, who was the victim support homicide caseworker at the time, who explained a little bit about David and Joan and their reasons for wanting to talk to us.
Well, Rick tried to tell us about restorative justice, but because Jacob didn't get a very long sentence, which at the time I was very bitter about, he felt that Jacob had nothing to gain from restorative justice, because sometimes at that time they were saying that if he'd got a longer sentence, he could have had a little bit of time off if he'd have gone through restorative justice. And myself, I was very bitter about the 14 months. Yeah, and I felt James's life was worth more than that, and he'd done nothing wrong. And at the time, there was the London riots, and people were getting more for stealing a television than James's life. And so when I went to appeal for that, they said that when you steal a television, it's with intent, but killing James wasn't with intent. I said, but a television and a life, and we just felt we were getting battered. So then restorative justice, we said we'd try that way forward. Luckily, Jacob agreed to come on board.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, Rick had that initial perception of restorative justice because it doesn't impact upon the kind of sentence outcome. But I think because it was so new to their team and their service at that point as well, I'm really pleased that Rick did put yourselves in contact with us because, that might never have happened had, you thought, well, it might not be worthwhile. So at the point that came through to us, as I said, Jan and I had an initial meeting with Rick, and then we contacted Joan and David to arrange a meeting. I suppose that first meeting was really about just building that initial relationship with myself and Jan to understand a little bit more about restorative justice and what it is, how it works, the potential benefits of it, but also, one of the key things in that initial meeting was explaining what some of the challenges are around restorative justice, because it's not as easy as somebody requesting it and then within a matter of weeks being able to move forward on that. There are many things that affect whether restorative justice can progress or not. That initial meeting was just really about understanding how might restorative justice help David and Joan.
Yeah. So after those initial discussions between yourselves, did your views change, Joan, from when you first explored it with Rick to when you met Nicola? Did you understand more about it? Or
So with Nicola, it was really helpful because although we asked her questions, when she came back with your answers, she didn't just say, oh, Jacob said, this happened or that happened. She said your expressions and your emotions so that it made you get a feel of the person. And that was really important at that time, really important.
Why did you want to have contact with me?
We'd got a lot of questions about the night, and there was the only person that could answer them was yourself. So restorative justice was the only way forward to get contact with you to answer the questions.
So Nicola, we're talking about a period of over a year of conversations. So you gathered those initial questions from Joan. Talk us through kind of when you first met me and ask me those questions.
I'll never forget the initial meeting with you in the probation office. You came in and in all honesty, you looked like a lost little boy, being honest. And I could see that you were struggling in terms of where you were going to live and what your future would be. And Jan and I explained a little bit about who Remedy were, about restorative justice. And then you'd already said that you were willing to do it. And you kept saying to us during that initial meeting, it's the right thing to do. If I can do anything for them, that's what I want to do. And Jan and I kept saying, and how do you think it would help you? And at that point, you couldn't see it at all. You said you felt that it was the right thing to do. And that was your motivation to answer questions. I do remember when we asked those initial questions that David and Joan had shared, and there were only a couple of questions that we asked in that initial meeting. But what you'd shared in that initial meeting with us, it felt to me and Jan quite strongly that it would be helpful for David and Joan to hear what you'd said. You agreed that we could share your kind of responses, but also how you responded. And so trying to share some of that with David and Joan in the way that we, saw, I think was important. And knowing that you had clear remorse and that you were almost for the first time really stopping to think about that wider impact. That was quite a poignant moment for us to see, and we wanted to try and give some of that to David and Joan in the initial response that we shared with them.
Yeah, because I guess it's easy to go back with, oh, did Jacob said this? But to say, this is how he looked and this is how he came across and he was showing remorse. And do you remember what I remember? But what those initial couple of questions, do you remember what they were?
Yes, I mean, there were some sort of key questions around why you'd ran away.
Yeah.
There were questions around, obviously, why you punched him, why you punched James, whether you'd had any kickboxing training. It was trying to piece that jigsaw together.
Yeah. And I always felt really shameful of all my answers because there's no moral good reason about any of it, to be honest, but there was no answer that I gave that I was proud of. There was no reason why I threw the punch, and I just had to keep answering all these questions, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm an awful person, basically. But it didn't feel too shameful, really. I don't know if it was the way you were approaching the area, because I know restorative justice tends to be done in the way where it's not about making somebody feel worse about themselves. I know that's easy to happen when you have to look in the mirror and think about the choices that you made. And I think it was just also helpful knowing that these questions you needed the answers to, Joan. And even though I wasn't proud of my answers, I hoped that it might help you in some small way.
Yeah.
And so there was more questions, wasn't there, to my initial answers. Yeah.
I think you asked a question about, how Jacob's mum had responded to what had happened, and understanding a little bit more about your family background as well, to, I suppose, to know what kind of support you'd got available. And that kind of genuine kindness came really early on from Joan and David around understanding what support you had in place, and that question of what is he going to do with his life now, which is the key and was the key question, I think, that probably made you stop short.
Can you remember him asking me that?
I can, yeah. I think you went silent for quite a while because you were just processing that question and the enormity of it. The fact that they'd been willing to ask, you could not quite comprehend.
Yeah.
But also, I think, where your head went then in terms of, so what am I going to do with my life?
Yeah.
I suppose as a restorative practitioner, you witness these moments that people have in their lives, and kind of, I suppose, epiphany moments. And that was one of those. And I remember coming away and thinking, that's been really pivotal for Jacob, that has.
Yeah,
and it was.
It was the light bulb. Why? What was it? Why did you ask me that? Why? How did you have any kind of care about what I was going to do and who I was?
When we found out what you were like, we thought, what would you do with your life now? Now you've done this. And my background is to care for people. I care for a lot of people in the hospitals. And I just felt that if you were shown some sort of care and understanding from me, then maybe you could find another way forward and stop offending. A few years before, James had been on a night out with a friend who was a large lad, and the lad was taken down backwards and his head was smashed on the pavement. James would stand up for somebody. So James was like, right, come on, somebody said something, help me here. And because the boy thought he was going to get arrested, he took a Stanley knife to James's face. He sliced his face right down the side of his face. So I got a call from James's mobile that night. It was the police officer saying, could I get to the hospital? James had lacerations to the face. When I got to the hospital, there was 24 of his friends outside the hospital wanting to get in or to support him. James was there with a bandage right around his face, saying he'd got to go to a bigger hospital because he needed Fax Max, which is a facial surgeon. And we then, obviously, James was sorted out and whatever, and it went to court. And then the boy went to prison for about 19 months, which served half of it. The night he was released, we lived in the same town, so obviously we were very nervous. James was very nervous to go out. His friends used to come and get him. But he went out, and that night, this young lad, he went into a pub, had a load of drink. For no reason at all, he left the pub, walked across the street and lacerated a man's face who was walking along with his family who hadn't even been in the pub. And I just didn't want you or people, the reoffending. I would just need it to stop. And restorative justice felt a way forward for that.
Yeah.
And for everything I do, I have to stand up for James.
Yeah.
But that was a big reason why I needed to
kind of try and break that cycle, encourage people to kind of stop going in and out of prison and just senseless.
And if we can stop some of that cycle, it's not going to work for everybody.
Yeah.
But if we can stop that cycle for some people, that's a big thing.
And then I guess the work began.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that you did, I suppose, probably in response to those second questions, was you wrote quite a detailed letter to Joan and David.
I remember you coming round to help me write the letter, and I was like, how on earth do I write a letter?
Yeah.
Can you remember getting those letters, Joan, or no, we're going back a few.
I know
going back a few years.
I can't really remember. I know there was a problem with you going to college or uni, and so that's when we brought up, what if we gave Jacob a reference?
That was when you'd started communicating with each other without the involvement of myself or Jan. But that was after the meeting.
That was after the meeting.
Yeah, because we shared Jacob's letter, and then it was at that point that there was more kind of interest in future, and you shared that you were going to go back to studying.
Yeah, I was going to try education again, go back into education. And I remember writing in that letter as well saying, I don't want to say sorry.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to say sorry to you. I want to prove through my actions that I mean what I say and that I've learned from what I've heard. And that was like, to just have your guys' support in the process. It was, even on a down day, it would just be like the ultimate motivator to go, David and Joan believe in me and they encouraging me. So, and I was just slowly over those years kind of having more faith in my own ability to do these things.
There was definitely a shift in your motivation, I think, in terms of thinking about your future. From that first time I'd met you in the probation office and looking lost, to starting restorative justice and then writing that letter and thinking about, what am I going to do with my future? How can I show Joan and David that I'm making a difference? There was a palpable change in that motivation. And it was always moving towards maybe the hope that you would meet in person at some point when you were ready.
Can you remember when you thought, because I know in initially when you came to see me at the beginning, Joan and David had said maybe in 10 years.
Yeah, that was what David said, maybe in 10 years.
Maybe in 10 years we'll meet him. Right?
Yeah.
But can you remember when you actually started to think, maybe I could meet him a bit earlier?
I think once, we'd seen that you were starting to turn your life around, and we realised that you were really sorry for what you had done and you'd owned up to it. And then you got your marks, didn't you, for your access to university.
Got access to university.
And so then we thought before you go to uni, we all sat down and thought that'd be a good time to in that break.
And I had no idea you were going to come back to me and say,
they're ready.
David and Joan are ready to kind of meet you. I was like, whoa.
I think Jan and I always knew that it would lead to a meeting. It was just a matter of time. Yeah. And so because you'd already shared quite a bit through us, we felt like we knew you all very well. We felt that the meeting, whilst definitely would be emotional and difficult for everybody involved, that it probably needed to happen at that point because you'd done, quite a lot of communicating through us, and it felt ready and time for you to be able to see each other and then talk about the next steps, because I think we both knew that you were really keen to campaign around the One Punch campaign to get that message out there. And it was about, how do you do that? How do you work together to do that? So you could see that was really important to them. And I knew from some of the work that you'd been doing and some of the interest in volunteering that, you wanted to get a message out to young people or people involved in violence as well. So you could see that it possibly might move to something. And again, you felt that's something that you wanted to do before you started university, before you went on that next path. You'd got your place at university, which is kind of what you'd said you'd committed to do, and you wanted to demonstrate to Joan and David that you would get that far, and you had. So it felt like the right time.
Yeah, and then that's when David and Joan were also like, make sure you're doing it for yourself.
Exactly, yeah. And that was a common message, I think, both from Joan and David, but also myself and Jan, of it's admirable that you want to do this for Joan and David, but also that can be a pressure when you've got other things going on. And we knew how strongly Joan and David felt about not putting you under further pressure. But I think that was a driving force for you throughout everything.
Yeah.
You could have gone down a different path, but I think that commitment to demonstrating you wanted to change kept you going.
And so, then you're going, right, guys, let's organise a space to kind of facilitate this meeting. And you'd prepared how the conversation was going to go, which I think is the golden rule in restorative justice is no surprises. When you bring people together, everybody should know kind of what to expect and how the conversation is going to go within reason.
Yeah, realistically, I suppose as a practitioner, you should know what everybody wants to say, maybe how the other person's going to respond to that. And, you can't 100% know every single thing, but, you know, enough time and preparation should have gone into it for there not to be any surprises. But you still, as practitioners, you're still nervous.
Oh, yeah.
I still felt nervous that day because it's important to us that it goes well for you, that you both feel that you've got out of it what you wanted to. And also recognising that there's going to be a lot of emotion in the room. And it had built up for such a long time as well for yourselves. That meeting felt like a really important step.
How were you, Joan?
I was relieved when I heard that you were actually on your way, because I thought you might get to a day you don't even leave Nottingham. Just probably anxious and upset, everything really at the same time. It was
Yeah. And I think what was strange from my point of view is that I'd never met you guys, but I felt like I knew you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you felt the same.
Yeah, I think because how good the facilitators were in saying, he's feeling this or he's down about that, and things that happen in your life as well. I think, you got the feeling of what sort of person you were.
Yeah. And then in the meeting, I remember you saying, Nicola, it's still important that we talk about the harm that was caused. And although I knew a bit about the harm, well, I did know the harm you told me in those early meetings. But I guess it was just important, because that was important for you, Joan and David, to be able to actually say it to my face and see it for yourselves, I guess.
I think for Joan and David to be able to see your response to that, like Jan and I had witnessed the first time we met you.
Yeah. But what can you remember about that meeting? I just remember being like...
Yeah, I remember you walking in and you looking a vulnerable young man.
Yeah.
And obviously you'd come into the lion's den. Big question. Take my hat off to you for it, really. Yeah, and we went over the questions about the night and different things just to hear you say it to us. Just wanted to hear where you're at with your life and what your plans were.
Yeah.
As well.
And then, as with many conversations, restorative questions, they lead towards a kind of, what next? A outcome agreement after the questions have been answered and the harm's been expressed. Yeah, then we decided that we were going to collaborate and keep in touch.
You had some of that, I suppose, that agreement there in the meeting around the fact that you wanted to do that and that you would share your details with each other. And then Jen and I did follow-up visits after your meeting just to check in and make sure there wasn't anything left unsaid and that you were still comfortable to have your details shared with each other. And I remember we agreed we'd do it via email, so I'd sent an email with the individual email details for all of you, and that was how then you started to communicate with each other directly. I think the first thing was you came, both of you, to speak at the Remedy AGM that later that year, and shared your experience of restorative justice with our staff and with some of our partners. And that led to quite a bit of interest. There was a request through Anna Hall, who made the Meeting My Enemy documentary with us to raise awareness. I think we then did a Channel 5 documentary and this morning, and I never thought it would probably lead to where we are today. With the play at the Playhouse, I thought you'd probably maybe talk at some events together, or
A couple of conferences.
raise awareness, and that would be it, and you'd both move on with your lives after that. But I think the power of seeing you both stand up and talk together about restorative justice and the journey that you'd all been on, it spoke to a lot of people, and they wanted to understand a little bit more about it.
And the big thing that people always ask is, they go, oh, well, how? What was it about Jacob, or what was it that he said that made it a worthwhile
I think it's
experience?
because you were totally honest, and that your reactions to what was asked. And also, Nicola was such a good facilitator in that she gave us time and space, and nothing was rushed, nothing was pushed. Everything was up on board. And
I think they often get why it was so impactful for me, because they go, hearing the harm you had, like, that must have been really hard. But sometimes they struggle a little bit more to understand how getting those answers.
No, I just think the police are very, they want to catch the criminal.
Yeah.
And they give you the basics. They don't tell you everything. And obviously they don't know everything, really. They're just, you're going to say no comment or whatever and then plead guilty. But they don't have all the undergone. And they've got no way of getting it once you've been sentenced. That's it. As you say, we didn't have the trial. Thank goodness we didn't have the trial. I'm glad we didn't have to go through that.
Yeah.
But, because of that, we didn't have answers.
And I think that's an important question for our justice system to think about, in terms of how we support other people who've been harmed by crime and their families. How do they get those answers met more commonly? Because not everybody will say yes to restorative justice. So it's about how can we still make sure that we support people who've been harmed by crime in our justice system to try and get some of those answers, or whether it's just in the way the police gather evidence, whether there's a way they can try and find out more information about the crimes, or what else can be done, I guess, to kind of make sure that people feel supported in those moments where it's, obviously very difficult.
That it demonstrates the power of restorative justice in many ways, though, doesn't it? Because
it does,
the Jacob that potentially was arrested was a very different Jacob to the one that came out of prison, to the one that then knew that Joan and David were interested in him. You went on that journey, and being able to understand you as a person, I think, has been very helpful to Joan and David.
Yeah, because when you just a mugshot, and when you just, I just imagine David and Joan as these people that even if I tried to think about them, I couldn't, and I try and push it out of my head because it was uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But then we were both able to find the truth out about each other, and then once you realise that we are all human, and you get to know each other, it's difficult to kind of not have a bit of empathy.
Yeah.
And then it just kind of develops from there, doesn't it?
It's important that as many people as possible know about it. I said to somebody last week, for me, my hope and vision is that the term and the understanding of restorative justice becomes as well known as the telephone number 111. Now, there is a long way to go with that.
We are doing our bit, right? We're doing our bit.
But that would be the hope. So I'd like it to be law, that, victims are informed about restorative justice, and that they receive information to be able to make that informed choice as to whether it's something they wish to explore. That's something that, whilst restorative justice is voluntary, and it's important that it remains voluntary, the information is, if you don't have information, you don't know it exists.
And would you recommend restorative justice to other people?
So before Victim Support offered us restorative justice, I didn't even know what it was. But yes, I would definitely recommend it to anybody else. They might not get as far as we have, but I'm sure it would help most crimes. Yeah,
because I think a lot of people feel like asking for longer in prison is going to make them feel better. Do you think that if we had got that appeal, and maybe I did do a lot longer in prison, that would have made you...
No, I think that's changed now, because we've done more than prison ever would for you, or I feel that. Yeah. And I feel that we've come a long way doing what we're doing. Yeah. And we might not have done this journey had you been in prison longer. Yeah. But this has done amazing for me, my own mental health, because, 14 months, I keep going on about it, but I was very bitter, and I don't have that bitterness anymore. Working with you and working with restorative justice has done this. Yeah. So I have gained loads myself. And I think also it's about restorative justice is showing you that if you do wrong, there is another way forward.
Mm.
You don't have to just reoffend and go back in.
Yeah,
There is
yeah.
another way forward. Although you've got that on your record, don't just down yourself. Look at a different way forward.
Yeah, 100%. I feel very grateful. Nicola and Joan, thank you so much for being on Right from Wrong. Thank you so much for the impact that you've both had on my life and for being the legends that you both are. So thank you very much.
And thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. It's a pleasure to be part of this journey with you both, definitely.
Next week, I'll be talking to Derek, my college teacher, who told me not to make excuses after coming out of prison and pursuing education. Be sure to give it a listen. In season 2 and beyond, it is super important for me to make sure I deliver a podcast that brings you the most value possible. And so I need your help. So if you could hit subscribe and follow, I'd really appreciate it.